with our fireside chat. And sort of a vision becoming reality today as we try to bring together a lot of the things that you've heard during the past 2 days, past 2.5 days. And I think brought down to the citizen level, to the local level. As you know, we have Chief Cathy Lanier, Chief of the D.C. Metropolitan Police Department. We have Jim Schwartz, who's the Chief of the Arlington County Fire Department. And on top of everything else, when you hear about people that don't talk and how there's no communication and all of that, well, that's not the case with these two. They are not only colleagues but friends, and they have a relationship that lends itself to information sharing, and that's the kind of leadership that they show to others. And you're going to get a flavor of that today. When we start, I want to remind you again, even in this room, we're using the special Q&A method. So if you have some questions, put them through to the website that you've been using all week, and we'll get that. This discussion is going to be facilitated, and it's going to be facilitated by Mr. Marko Bourne, who is with Booz, Allen, and Hamilton. He brings an interesting perspective to that position, having worked for FEMA for quite a long time and has long been in emergency management. So he helped develop the questions and the areas that these two luminaries, local luminaries we'll call them, will address. And it's also as I told you yesterday, we couldn't put on the conference without our corporate sponsors. And today we're recognizing three companies and remember, you don't hold your applause, and who you are wave when I say your name. So from NJVC, we've got Miss Lynn DeCourcy, who's the Vice President for Cybersecurity. There's Lynn. From SAIC, the Vice President and Director of Sales and Business Development, Mr. Mark Zuffa. And Mark happens to be sitting with Chief Lanier's right-hand person, Lieutenant Morgan Kane. So, hi, Morgan. Hope I got that close. And then today's lunch sponsor, as you can see up here, is Citizen. We're very happy to have them. And representing Citizen is Mr. Van Kierstein, Director of Business Development. And he's going to do the honors for our panel.
Thank you, Becky. On behalf of AFCEA and Citizen, it's my pleasure to present to you our fireside chat participants. As Becky mentioned, Chief Cathy Lanier, Chief James Schwartz. I pulled some highlights from their bios. I think we all have either heard a presentation, seen them, listened to WTOP, but I thought at least we had to pull some highlights out of here. So I'll start with Chief Lanier first of all. Obviously, Chief District Columbia Metropolitan Police Department, but during her command, she's committed to reducing violent crimes through the strong relationships fostered with partners in the community as well as those with the criminal justice system. She's expanded various modes of communication to include the use of social media, which we heard about today, that being Facebook and Twitter. Her department has taken on the acceptance of anonymous text tips to help solve these crimes, and she's also implemented a reward program, for those that are proven to help reduce violent crimes. As a matter of fact, from 2007 through 2011, there's been over $1 million in rewards for information that's led to the arrest and conviction of violent criminals. I think a key thing here are these communications and these partnerships, that they've played a key role in the significant decrease in the number of homicides in the District of Columbia. At the end of 2011, the number was down to 108, and that represents a 42% decrease over the past 3 years. Pretty phenomenal statistics there. A little bit about Chief Lanier herself. 2006, Metropolitan Police Department's Office of Homeland Security and Counterterrorism was created, and Chief Lanier was tapped to be its first commanding officer. On April 3rd, 2007, Chief Lanier was unanimously confirmed as the Chief of Police by the Council of the District of Columbia. She's a graduate of the FBI National Academy and the Federal Drug Enforcement Administration's Drug Unit Commanders Academy. She holds both a bachelor's and a master's degree from Johns Hopkins in management and a master's degree in national security studies from the Naval Postgraduate School. So now let me move on to Chief Schwartz. Chief Schwartz has been with the Arlington Fire Department for 28 years and was appointed chief in June of 2004. He oversees and manages his department of 320 personnel that provide fire, EMS, hazmat, and technical rescue response to a community of 210,000 people, not personnel, excuse me. The department itself was the lead agency to the response at the Pentagon on 9/11, and Chief Schwartz led that unified command effort. He also chairs the International Association of Fire Chiefs Committee on Terrorism and Homeland Security. In 2009, Chief Schwartz was appointed by the Secretary of Homeland Security to the Homeland Security Quadrennial Review Advisory Committee. He's a member of the faculty of the Kennedy School at Harvard University, where he lectures in Leadership and Crisis Program. Chief Schwartz is a graduate from University of Maryland with a bachelor's degree in fire administration, and he's also a graduate of the Executive Leaders Program at the Center for Homeland Defense and Security at the National Naval Postgraduate School. So, you know, you read through these bios, and there's a little bit of a theme that I pulled out of there for both of our presenters, and that's longevity in the community and commitment to the community. You know, and I look around the room and I see a lot of familiar faces that I've seen over the years working in the Homeland Security community, and you definitely feel this sense of community here. And it's really my belief, and I'm sure it's many others in the room, that it's this dedication of this room, it's the dedication of the chiefs, their staffs, and really, again, all of us, this is what keeps this homeland secure. And I really firmly believe in that, and that's why we're here today. So please help me in welcoming Marko Bourne, Chief Cathy Lanier, and Chief James Schwartz.
You have to flip it from our shirt.
Good. Thank you. Oh, you have it on. Yeah. All right.
We on yet? Yes, we are. Good afternoon, everybody. Pleasure to be here today and help to moderate this fireside chat. You know, when you look at the National Capital Region, it is probably one of the most complicated jurisdictional areas in the country. We talk a lot about large cities, Philadelphia, New York, Los Angeles, et cetera. And yes, there are jurisdictional issues, you know, counties surrounding cities, cities being necessarily divided up. But the National Capital Region is unique, and it's unique because not only is it the seat of the federal government, it's a federal district, but there are multiple jurisdictions that are part of that National Capital Region. 2 states, the district, several counties in those 2 states. There's even coordination that has to take place as far west as West Virginia, and in some cases even up into southern Pennsylvania. And when you look at the National Capital Region, even within the district itself, there's a large workforce that leaves every night, comes in every morning, and there is all the traffic considerations, all the planning considerations, and when an emergencies, disasters, or a terrorist event can strike this region, it complicates how communities work together. A lot has changed in the district and in the region in the last 2 decades. I was here back in the early 80s, and certainly when the Air Florida crash happened on the 14th Street Bridge and into the river, a lot of jurisdictional challenges were identified, recognized, and took time to overcome. Fast forwarding to 9/11, I had the distinct, I would say, honor to not only be with FEMA at the time, and be at the Pentagon in the first 5 days of the event following 9/11, working with Chief Schwartz and the others in the Urban Search and Rescue Program. And to see the coordination that took place between the Department of Defense, Arlington, the various jurisdictions in the federal district, the federal government, the FBI, et cetera, under that incident command structure was just a wonderful sight to behold, because it showed how far things had come. And I contrast that a little bit, not to be critical, with New York, where the challenges of incident command were huge. And there wasn't necessarily a tremendous rapport between fire and police and some of the other jurisdictions up there that can be common in communities. I came out of both the fire service and the law enforcement background, so I'm persona non grata to both sides now because I defected from one to the other. And of course, nobody likes emergency managers, so we just go down that road. But that said, in the National Capital Region, that coordination has to be taken to an entirely different level. And whether it is the earthquake of a few months ago, Snowmageddon of a year ago, information sharing, cooperation, coordination are key. So our two speakers here today are certainly knee-deep in that process. They are part of the planning, they are part of the dialogue, they have unique challenges that face their departments, and what we wanted to do was provide them an opportunity to talk about what coordination is like, what the information sharing is, what are the challenges they have about preparing for events or heading off events, quite frankly, before they happen, especially when it comes to disruptions to public health and safety. And then how they look at working together and sharing information in the future as events unfold. With that, I'd like to turn it over to both of our speakers. They'll talk for 10 or so minutes, 10 or 15 minutes, about some of these challenges, some of the issues that they're addressing and facing, and where they see the vision moving forward, not only for this region, but I think the lessons we can learn nationally from the district and from this region that can be extrapolated to almost any community in the country who don't have quite as complex a situation to deal with, but still can learn tremendous value from it. With that, then following that, we'll take Q&A. I have some questions, and certainly we'll be opening it up to folks to ask questions as well. With that, Chief Lanier.
So just to give the folks in the room just some idea how complex the jurisdictional issue is just in the district. If you stand in one spot on Pennsylvania Avenue, you're in my jurisdiction. If you stand on the left curb, you're in the Park Police's territory. If you stand on the right curb, you're in Secret Service's territory. Literally, that is just how complex the jurisdictional issues are here. There are, in total, about 32 different law enforcement agencies in the city. We are the real police, though, the Metropolitan Police. Put it this way, when you dial 911, it's my phone that rings. It's not the Capitol Police. There's no Capitol Police here, is there? So, and I say that to them all the time, and just in joking. But the good thing about that complexity is that we work together every single day. We have dignitary movements around the city every day. We move the president, the vice presidents, any foreign heads of state. So there's teams in Special Operations Division that work together with the fire partners across the region. Most of our dignitaries don't just stay in the district, they travel around the region, so those teams work together every day. And then we have the privilege of all of the large special events that are here. So when you talk about preparedness, information sharing, and all those things are important. There's pre-planned events, right, like the inauguration, bringing 2 million people into the city and making sure that people with the purple tickets don't get stuck in the tunnel. For anybody that's from the region, that's funny. That was the Capitol Police, by the way. You didn't see anybody raise their hand when I said, is there anybody here from Capitol Police, did you? So, so there's the pre-planned events, and then there's the man-made events, the active shooter, the Holocaust Museum shooting, which again was multi-jurisdictional. And then there's the accidental, the accidents, transportation accidents. We had a huge metro train crash here 2 years ago. It brought in a lot of assets from around the region, and particularly fire emergency services from all over the region. So you have to know how to do all those things. And then there's the Snowmageddon, I'm sorry. Then there's the weather-related events. And the first snowflake in Washington, D.C. is a weather-related crisis.
Actually, just the prediction of a snowflake.
Right, the prediction of snow, right? But the core things that you have to master are all the same. They're all the same for all of those things. One is you have to have everybody that in the region that you may have to rely on speed dial, and you have to know that person, and there has to be an understanding of who leads in what incident and when does that lead switch over? Who's the lead agency? If it's a fire life safety, when the metro train crash happened, I immediately went to the scene and set up for the fire chief, traffic closures, set up emergency routes to bring in extra firefighters and paramedics. We sent escort teams out to bring them in, get them into the city. You know, he was the lead. My job is to support him. Fire, life safety, until you get through that saving lives portion of it, my job is to support the chief. So, you know, everybody understanding everybody's roles, everybody knowing everybody very well, and having those pre-plans in place are critical. It's no different for the snowstorm. It's no different for the inauguration. It's no different for large protests. Several weeks ago, we had several thousand protesters. We got information the night before that they wanted to shut the Key Bridge down. And so in about 14 hours, they were going to use large vehicles, potentially put the vehicles on the bridge and chain themselves to the vehicles, big buses and stuff to stop traffic from getting across the bridge in rush hour. And by 5 o'clock the next morning, we literally had firefighters on the other side of the bridge in Virginia with their heavy cranes standing by, staged on the edge of the bridges, cranes on our side, ambulances set up. By the time the protesters started marching, when they got to the bridge, they just took the little walkway and went across on the side, because there was nothing they could do to disrupt. We had coordinated with Department of Public Works on both sides of both jurisdictions. We had dump trucks and front-end loaders if we needed them. We had, you know, fire equipment there. So there was nothing they could do to take that bridge that we couldn't have cleared very quickly. And so that's what I mean about having those pre-plans and everybody on speed dial, because you're going to have to pull that stuff together quickly. So the same thing happens then when you have, you know, the man-made crisis, you know, the Holocaust Museum. What a lot of people don't realize with that situation, when I was actually just a few minutes away when the first shots were fired at the Holocaust, as soon as we got word that there was a shooting at the Holocaust Museum, you know it's probably not good. And when I get on the scene, you know, the Holocaust Museum, it's a private entity. They have private security. It actually sits on Park Police's territory, but they had different security inside the Holocaust Museum. It's in the District of Columbia, so the street out front where the shooter's car was is in my jurisdiction. And the fact that we had von Bourne, who was the shooter who was shot in the head, and the guard who was shot actually up in the shoulder area, as soon as we got on the scene, we believed that the shooter was going to die. He was in his late 70s, early 80s, and he's shot in the head. So the only police agency in the city that can investigate a homicide is the Metropolitan Police Department. So coordinating that immediate on-scene incident command and getting that sweeping for secondary devices, making sure we're managing that scene and determining jurisdiction. Even though Park had the lead on that, clearing that museum, I have 400 active shooter teams that are trained, then 150 of them on the street at any given time. Park Police doesn't have that surge capacity, so we had to have those good relationships where I could start pulling those active shooter teams in and get in and sweep that building and clear what we needed to clear. And so making sure nobody's struggling for territory or jurisdiction is really important when things are unfolding that fast. So these are all the same things that matter when you look at Homeland Security and counterterrorism. Information sharing between state, local, federal. Information sharing across the region. Right after 9/11, I'll never forget, one of my best friends was the fire chief's, the SOD commander for the fire department in DC. And I was getting all these classified briefings, and I kept saying to the FBI guys, look, I need you to brief the chief from fire. Well, no, there's no need to know. And there was, at one point, there was an airliner threat. Many of you may remember, a few years ago, airliner threat to the United States from the UK. And the planes involved were going to cross into U.S. airspace at about 4 in the morning. So I told the FBI, ASEC over here, I said, look, I really need you to brief the SOD commander from the Fireside. Well, he doesn't have a need to know. I said, look, there's one foam truck in this city. And that's the guy that decides whether it's staffed on midnights or not. And if that airline makes it through into airspace here, don't you think it's important that that foam truck is staffed and that he understands what the potential threat is for a commercial airliner coming into our space? And that's what it takes, and I think that has been the big challenge. And now there's routinely fire chiefs and fire command folks around the region are all have received clearances and get briefings. And the gap really wasn't that the intelligence community didn't want to share information with us at the local level. They didn't understand our need to know, because they don't really know what we do on a daily basis and what capabilities we have. So those are the big things that we've overcome since the 9/11. So from 9/11 to now, a tremendous change. And here in the National Capital Region, I think we get a lot of practice, so it helps us out quite a bit.
Great. Chief Schwartz?
Echoing everything that Chief Lanier said and adding a little bit, as much as has been accomplished since 9/11, we really are building on some rather historical events. Marko mentions Air Florida in 1982, which, quite frankly, the region was justifiably criticized because we did not have, as a larger NCR, a lot of the capabilities, a lot of the relationships, a lot of the interoperable communications that we benefit from now. And we were also sort of walled off in our sub-regions, if you will. Northern Virginia sort of kept to itself, you know, even though it bordered Virginia, or bordered the district rather. Suburban Maryland, a little less so for some reasons we won't go into now. I always appreciate Cathy's observations about things like jurisdictional divides, you know, standing on Pennsylvania Avenue and who's got jurisdiction. We have a smaller version of that in Northern Virginia. We have a particular cul-de-sac, dead-end street that you access through Arlington County, and when you go up that street, there are 6 houses on that dead end. The 2 of them on the right are in Fairfax County, the 2 in the middle are in the city of Alexandria, and the 2 on the left are in Arlington County.
Who does these things?
There certainly isn't any rationale for it, but you know, anybody from any of those 6 houses that dials 911, you know, the resources are coming up that one street. And you know, I would suggest that whoever is in that state, you know, where they need they need just, you know, routine services from our emergency organizations, they really don't care what the side of the fire truck or the police car says, right? They don't care what this patch looks like. They want competent, compassionate care. And so back in 1975, the fire chiefs in Arlington, Alexandria, and Fairfax entered into an agreement where, for all intents and purposes, the jurisdictional boundaries were dropped. That relationship exists today, where we send the closest resources to a request for service anywhere in those 3 jurisdictions, and more bringing on Prince William County and Loudoun County, because the populations that we serve are pushing out in those directions, and we line up a response based on the closest resource available. We have evolved that set of relationships so that the standard operating procedures are all the same across the entire region. So you don't go to a house fire differently on those houses on the right-hand side of the cul-de-sac than you do on the left-hand side. This is very unique. There aren't very many places in the country that do this. The only place that I know that's even close is the Phoenix Valley, and quite frankly, the way that it works in Phoenix is you subscribe to the Phoenix way of doing things. If you want to be a part of that regional collaborative, you know, they set the rules, they write the policy, and if you want to sign up, this is what you adopt. And we do that differently in Northern Virginia, where it's a highly collaborative process. So take this to the larger NCR. Again, a little bit of history that fits between 1982 and Air Florida and 2001 9/11 attack on the Pentagon. Obviously, in 1995, we have the Murrah building bombing in Oklahoma City. We had another large event in the world that got less attention, probably, except for people paying attention to terrorism, and that was the sarin attack in the Tokyo subway. When the sarin attack in the Tokyo subway occurred, the NCR got a little bit concerned about not only the threat of terrorism, but what the implications might be to a big piece of what is now known as critical infrastructure, being our metro system. So we had the audacity to write the President of the United States a letter. I actually wrote the letter, but it was signed by Jack Evans, who was the chair of the COG at the time. And the letter said to President Clinton, you just witnessed what happened in Tokyo. We have a pretty good subway here that, you know, the local economy and certainly the federal government is dependent on. If that incident happened here, we don't have the training, we don't have the knowledge, we don't have the equipment necessary to deal with that kind of a crisis. The President tasked HHS, the Department of Health and Human Services, and ultimately the U.S. Public Health Service to work with the region. And in 1996, a specialized team, the nation's first non-military terrorism response team, went live in the NCR. It was a team that had the MMST, the Metropolitan Medical Strike Team. It had mass decontamination capabilities. It had its own resources for chemical antidote exposure. It had detection equipment that was so sophisticated it didn't exist anywhere else in the non-military world. It didn't exist in the civilian world. We all have it now because of 9/11, but back then it was highly unique. And this team was made up of fire, EMS, hazmat, and law enforcement components, or representatives rather, from the entire NCR. That team became so important to the NCR that beginning in 1996 and until earlier this year when the team was dismantled for reasons that I'd love to talk to somebody offline about but won't do here. The team was forward deployed on all State of the Union addresses and all presidential inaugurations. When the president would be inaugurated out on the East Coast, or the platform built over the East Capitol steps, East steps of the Capitol, part of that team would be underneath that platform and would be tasked with getting people off the platform should it be attacked in the middle of the inauguration. During the State of the Union address, a large component of that team would be in the floor beneath the House chamber, half suited up and ready to go up a very small winding stairway into the House chamber with the express mission of rescuing the legislative leadership of the United States Congress. The president had his own resources. This team became a model for the rest of the country and in fact became the catalyst for something called the Metropolitan Medical Response System, which was a way to organize at the local level the different components of a community's response system: fire, EMS, hazmat, law enforcement, emergency management, hospitals. MMRS, which is now resident in 124 cities across the country and started right here in the National Capital Region, is the only federal program that creates a bridge between what government's going to do in a crisis and what the component of the private healthcare system, hospitals that are community assets and are most important to us in those crises, what are they going to do? It created a collaborative space where those different professions, those different entities could come together and figure out how to do joint operational training. As I say, it exists now in 124 cities across the country to varying degrees. It's unfortunate that the program has actually been zeroed out of the grant processes that we enjoy right now. But it's interesting that program at its height was a $70 million program in the federal budget, which I always imagined had policymakers looking at it and wondering what the hell good is $70 million doing for anything. Because when you broke that down and distributed it across those 124 jurisdictions, it was a relatively modest sum, about $300,000 that went to each of those jurisdictions. But it was an enormously effective catalyst to get people together, work across the boundaries that are necessary for us to be effective in our routine incidents, some of which the chief was just describing, but have to be set aside when we're dealing with a crisis, when we're dealing with the novelty that events like 9/11 and anthrax on Capitol Hill and even the shooting at the Holocaust Museum present to us. So it's those kinds of structures that we have come to almost naturally in the NCR and have to be forced in more jurisdictions across the country. I'm glad to say in some ways it is evolving elsewhere in the country too, and they are, I think, in many areas catching up with us. But as Marko said, this ought to be the hardest place on the planet to achieve some of the successes that we enjoy today. And in part because of the experience of the NCR, but also because of the leadership and the vision of the NCR, we've seen some great successes that I think provide some enormous capabilities to this region. And who would deny that we need them for such an important place? So I'll leave it there and go to the questions.
Thank you. Wonderful openings. Thank you both. As you talked about some of the events in the district, certainly with what could have been described as a classic prevention activity when you found out about the group that wanted to close the Key Bridge and taking the steps you did to prevent that from happening. It really comes to the entire spectrum of Homeland Security: prevention, protection, response, recovery, mitigation. All of that is really the nexus of capabilities, but more often information. And understanding how information is used, how it is shared, the situational awareness that's created by having that information. What are some of the mechanisms that you all use to not only gather some of that information, but make sure it's shared with the right people? You'd mentioned about the FBI needing to know that, wanting to understand the need to know. Mm-hmm. Do you have those processes in place? What are some of the things that you use on a daily basis to communicate across the jurisdictions and certainly across your various division heads and chiefs of various departments within the area?
I mean, there's a lot of formal structures, and it varies by what information that you're sharing. I'd say that the national capital region, pretty much on all issues through either COG, the Council of Governments for the region. Our fusion centers are very well connected, which actually the fusion centers gives us connectivity all over the country, which has been a very welcome added piece of to the information sharing environment. And then there's the personal relationships that can't be understated, and a lot of that goes on daily through a variety of personal interactions, telephone calls, electronic communications, and but it has to go beyond just the responders, and the information sharing with the private sector has been very important to us. In many of the occasions we have large special events here, we could not accomplish what we have to accomplish without bringing in private sector partners. We now rely on those same partners when crisis hits. So working with some of the building owners in the city, working with the hospitality industry, hotel association, the BIDs, the business improvement districts. You know, we rely on them during large special events since we've built those relationships, but when crisis hits, we call up on them as well. And in fact, when crisis hits, they come to us usually before we have a chance to call on them. So the information sharing, I think we have a very robust way for information sharing amongst government entities here. And bringing those private sector partners has been really, really important.
Yeah, I would observe that you know, government is in a lot of different businesses, but is accurately described oftentimes as a bureaucracy, right? I mean, and bureaucracies are sometimes important to get things done. The Homeland Security enterprise is really a social system. It has to be viewed in ways that, you know, typical bureaucratic approaches to problem solving just don't get at. So Cathy's right, the ability to just pick up the phone and call somebody and get the information that you need. I think she would agree that one of our greatest responsibilities as agency heads, as leaders in the Homeland Security enterprise, is to continue to foster the institutionalization of these leadership behaviors, because you know, we're only going to be around for so long, and and on a fairly regular basis, we watch the turnover of leaders.
That's one of the biggest weaknesses at the local level.
Yeah, so it is really important for us to stay focused on, you know, getting, whether it's an elected leader or an appointed leader, into this social system so that they understand the interdependence, right? That these national security special events, or even just those things where we share resources on a mutual aid basis, make us all interdependent. We all rely on each other. And so there's an understanding, I think, in this region that trusted relationships, you know, building bonds of trust are sort of what greases things in ways that doesn't happen in a lot of other areas. But it is that acknowledgement that you have to get to know people, and you have to go into these relationships with some expectation of what you're going to give, not what you're going to get.
Great point. It kind of goes also to extrapolate that out a little bit to the issue of, excuse me, public expectation. And the fact that information is far more available today than it's ever been before. There's so many more avenues: social media, 24-hour news cycles, stations that are on all the time looking for anything and everything. You know, when you're watching a car chase in Washington that's happening in California, you know, sometimes you wonder, why are we watching this? But it's on, it's there. How do you adjust to that, especially when it comes to some of the planning, and then, quite frankly, maintaining a certain level of public expectation when it comes to your ability to deal with a situation, respond to it, and resolve it?
I think that's you use it to your advantage. Obviously, I mean, it's difficult sometimes. Sometimes there's the tense relationship with the 24-hour news cycle, but a lot of times it works to your advantage. We use, as it was mentioned in the introduction, we use Twitter and Facebook and a lot of those other different ways to reach out to very large groups of people. And we right now have a huge following of people that follow, because we put out, you know, traffic management alerts. We put out alerts when there's different situations, crime situations, and people get used to watching that. And our followings get bigger and bigger and bigger. We have 17,000 or so people on our listserv. So we've got a multitude of different ways to reach a lot of different people. Texting, you know, we send out texts through DC Alert, and we have, so our following is just massive now of people from the region. And so they're so used to following us, if something were to happen and there was no way to communicate through television or through radio, the power, large power outages, at least for, an initial period of time, we'd have a very robust way to communicate with a very large number of people. And the first thing they would do is they'd go to that listserv, they'd go to that Twitter site, and they'd be looking to see what's coming from the police department. What do they want me to do? Where should I go? So that's why institutionalizing the things that, like the chief was talking about, institutionalizing those things are really, really important in making sure that people know that there's going to be constant information coming from the the emergency responders. We had a case last year where we had a shooting that took place, and right after the shooting, the suspect hijacked a handicap transportation van with an elderly woman in the van, and carjacked 4:45 in the afternoon, which is, anybody in DC knows, is rush hour, and most people that are in their cars are listening to what? WTOP. So I called Mark Seagraves from the scene. I said, I need you to put this lookout out now. And an off-duty park police officer listening to TOP was behind the car on 295, and we caught that guy because of that instant connection to the media. So it works. It works to our advantage.
Yeah, the other dimension of this, I think, too, is that, at the agency level, as the chief describes, there are these capabilities. But in a crisis, like 9/11 or even some of the weather-related events, we're expected to act as a region. And so we have a body of people that focus on external communications. It's a regional group. As a matter of fact, they just here recently went live with a virtual joint information center, so that we can get out to the agencies all of the messages that might be pushed on the individual, in the individual pathways, but ensure that we have a consistent message across the region. Because while there may be parts of a message that need to be customized, as the chief was describing in that example, there may be other aspects that we need to ensure the information is the same. What we don't want to do is create confusion because one agency or one jurisdiction is putting out this message and another is putting out something seemingly in conflict with that. So we go to great lengths, especially when an event is affecting the entire region, to harmonize the messages. And so our theme is one message, many pathways. So, that we can use, the trusted sources that people have come to rely on a day-to-day basis, but we don't worry about getting the messages, off kilter and creating more confusion and chaos, in that.
Well, certainly when you do external communications, that's incredibly important. It's also then has to be based on having common understanding of the operating environment you're in, and a common operating picture that you're using on an operational basis in order to make decisions. How much is technology playing a role in supporting your ability to maintain that common operating awareness so that you can not only prioritize your operational requirements, but also make sure that you're communicating effectively to the public in a uniform way?
That's huge. It's right now, radio encryption is a big one.
Yeah.
Everybody's about 7 or 8 years ago, the county, Prince George's County, moved to a newer radio system, 800 megahertz. Most of the people in the region had moved to 800 megahertz. Systems, but as we're moving towards about a 7-year project now, P25, for interoperable communications in the region, I just moved to AES, DES encryption. For anybody that knows anything about encryption, it is the encryption that you need for the future as everybody moves into the 800 megahertz spectrum. And because the upgrades began so many years ago when the county started their upgrades, now with my radio encryption, I can communicate, share with most of the other jurisdictions, but the first jurisdiction that started moving in this direction only had DES. So their radios will not receive our encryption. So now they're going to have to do another upgrade as we move into the P25 environment for multi-agency encrypted communication. Now, we've got ways to communicate because we have mutual aid channels that are unencrypted, but that encryption and the technology, in order for us to remain operable, has to be coordinated as a region. We can't do anything. There's 26 municipal police departments in Prince George's County alone. And so any changes that any one of us make in a communication device can mess everybody else in the region up, so we have to coordinate that.
It almost is a governance issue in many respects.
Yeah, in Northern Virginia, we've actually begun to tackle this by creating a strategic roadmap to ensure the sustainment of the interoperability that we enjoy today. And it is the governance issue becomes a really large challenge, you know, because you've got infrastructures, communications infrastructures that are in different phases of their life cycles. So when one is going into the next generation, there may be many that aren't yet to move, you know, aren't ready to move there yet. So how do you maintain that? But again, it goes back in part to some of those relationships. We have, you know, we have region communications committees that are constantly working on this to ensure that whatever systems we're on, we can communicate. You know, we're also smart about a lot of the technology investments we make as a region. One of the very first things that we invested in with our Homeland Security grant dollars was the interconnections of each of our institutional networks. Each of the jurisdictions had built fiber networks for use within their jurisdiction. Well, we took one of the first sets of Homeland Security grant dollars and we connected all of those systems. So we have now what's called the NCR net. We added to that something we call the Data Exchange Hub, which was a very unique ability to take data from disparate sources, you know, mash it together and put it out in ways that could be recognized by the various systems. And I'll give you an example, and it goes how we utilize that, and it goes back to the whole issue of situational awareness. So each of us operates different our own communication centers, and part of that is a computer-aided dispatch system, CAD, which takes all of our data and essentially runs algorithms to give us recommendations on resources and that sort of thing. But everybody runs their own, and the CAD vendors are all proprietary, so even if you buy from the same vendor, the systems aren't going to talk to each other. The Data Exchange Hub overcomes that for us. So we ran a pilot for the last 2 years. It's about to be expanded to a few more jurisdictions where Arlington, Alexandria, and Fairfax are all connected to what we call CAD to CAD. So our CAD systems are essentially talking to each other. When I mentioned before that we dropped the jurisdictional boundaries for the sharing of resources, it used to take us 2 minutes to process a call that used more than one jurisdiction because it had to be processed through different CAD systems. That 2 minutes has been reduced now to less than 2 seconds because when one jurisdiction is entering the CAD data, it's showing up on the other CAD systems that are going to provide resources to the response. We're going to expand that for not just response, but some other capabilities. The district's coming online with the CAD to CAD here in the next phase. And so we're being smart about a lot of our technologies where we're overcoming some of the proprietary natures and the impediments that are caused by life cycles. You know, we're using some of these resources, some of these scarce resources to fix some of these technology problems and be wise about, you know, how we maintain the interconnectedness.
We also want to open it up certainly to questions and through the system that we have available. So are we going to, there's nothing up yet. I've just got a user login screen.
Yeah, do we have to log in or something?
Do we have to log something in? Yeah, we're just seeing the user login screen. But anyway, is that, while we're waiting for that, I'd like to pull on
some questions.
I'd like to pull on the thread of resources a little bit. Obviously, federal budgets are declining. Grant programs have been significantly cut. State and local budgets have been under pressure for much longer than that, and certainly continue to have pressure. How do you maintain, you know, beyond the willingness to want to work together? Obviously, there is a cost involved. How do you maintain that given budget pressures the way they are?
It's tough choices every day. I mean, there's just tough choices, and the support from federal funding is dwindling as well. I mean, our local budgets have been cut for the past 4 or 5 years in most places. So making those tough choices, finding efficiencies. Fortunately, you know, some of the technological advances have helped us find efficiencies to survive those initial local cuts. But now with the federal cuts, you know, AFCEA is one of the big things. The Urban Area Security Initiative is what has paid for most of our the technology that we've been talking about to be interoperable and set up those connections. And now we're all trying to determine how we can even just maintain what we have if, you know, what remains in the grant funding. And important things are getting cut, like the Chief talked about earlier. So it's been tough, and I can't say that everybody's confident that we are maintaining. I mean, we're doing the best we can, but it is very tough.
Yeah, it's very much a challenge. I do think we benefit from the fact that our our elected leadership and a lot of our appointed leadership do recognize, the inherent responsibilities we have for this region. I mean, the NCR is a statutory designation for a reason. It exists in federal law because the protection of, the federal city and the center of government is extremely important, to our function as a nation and certainly to our way of life. So I think that over these years where we've had the benefit of a lot of the grant dollars, and let us not forget that the investments that have come from the local jurisdictions far exceed the grant dollars. People tend to forget, people tend to think that the grant crack that we have benefited from over the years is something, that we are addicted to. But the fact is the investments that the chief makes, the investments that I make, and that our elected leaders support us in making far outweigh any of the grant dollars. So we're glad to have them, but I think there is a greater awareness today that this has become an inherent responsibility for the region.
Okay, we can do that. We're going to forego the technology and use a traditional Q&A. Do we have a question? I saw a hand over here. Yes, sir.
Yes, I wanted to address this to Chief Schwartz. It seems like part of the response to many incidents, either because of the cause or because of the resource, involves one of the public utilities, whether it be electric or water or gas. How have you planned, how are they integrated into your response team? Sorry. Into your interoperability, your CAD, your common operating.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a good question. One of the steps that most of the jurisdictions have taken is to have representatives from the utilities in their emergency operations centers. Give them a desk in the emergency operations center so that there is a direct connection. We have long had good relationships with them in the field. When we have big thunderstorms or things that take down wires, to just use that routine example. Or gas leaks, the breaches in gas lines. We already are well socialized in the field to work together. We don't have interoperability per se at the field level, but we're gaining more and more of that through our emergency operations centers. And to extend that a little bit further, one of the things that we're doing is trying to connect the customer with some of that situational awareness also. So in Northern Virginia, we are piloting a project right now that is making accessible to anybody who has access to the web during a crisis the status of various resources not like the utilities, what areas are out and what the timeline looks like for restoration of power, so we can get that directly out to them through a common portal, even though the utilities are providing more and more of that themselves, and we're putting that alongside other resources like which pharmacies are still open, right? So if you are, we're working with the Targets and the Walmarts and the CVS's and the Rite Aids, so that they are posting to this portal and making their status available to the community. So if people know, well, power's out, so this CVS isn't open, but I need my prescription, the nearest one that I can access is over here. It takes somewhat of the burden off the requests into the EOC and to our PIOs, and provides information that's transparent and immediately accessible to the community. So it's those kinds of things that we're continuing to try to evolve.
Another question? Right here in the middle.
This is for Chief Lanier.
You got mics. Or at least
Get him, Becky.
This is for Chief Lanier. With Occupation Wall Street, you talked about budget constraints and so forth, and I know a big part of the media is the cost that Occupation Wall Street has imposed on the local community. How do you wrestle with, letting people, protest and, take up a lot of your resources, that delicate balance?
Well, I can tell you historically from the lawsuits, we're not spending as much if we let them express their First Amendment rights in public space. But I've been here 21 years, so I've seen the protest movement really change over the years. Like the Occupy movement, they're very well versed in what their rights are, their First Amendment rights are, and there's a small group in there, and in every Occupy movement I've seen, there's a small group of people in there that really are not here to protest and express their First Amendment rights. They've got, other things on their mind. They self-identify as anarchists, and they're here to cause problems, and those are the ones that really give us the most problems. But we have about 2,800 special events and protests in Washington, D.C. every year. Every single day there are 4 or 5 groups protesting in Washington, D.C. They can be as small as 20 people and as large as you know, 800,000 people. I mean, you know, we have huge protests here all the time. We have a special operations division that's set aside, designed to deal with that. When you have, you know, the anarchist core that is here. I'll give you an example for the alfalfa dinner that occurred here in a big hotel a few weeks ago. Because we knew that the anarchists' whole goal, I mean, we had 4 prior presidents and Supreme Court justices and everybody at this dinner. The anarchists' goal was to disrupt this dinner somehow. And so a group of, you know, 200 people that want to be disruptive took a tremendous amount of resources from me to deal with them and keep them from disrupting this dinner. Those are the things that we get federal reimbursement for here in the city. These are all events that wouldn't happen otherwise if we weren't the seat of the federal government here, so we do get reimbursed for that. It's frustrating. We don't mind the big groups that come here to protest. We have, you know, marches that are, like I say, that'll go on all day long, thousands, hundreds of thousands of protesters. It's the anarchists that are frustrating, the people that come here just to be disruptive, to destroy property, and, you know, do things they shouldn't. But we do get some reimbursement from the federal government for that.
I think I saw a question. Oh, okay, I guess over here.
Mike Kelly with Task. For either one of you, what do you worry about the most? What do you think your most significant challenges to be are? We're all interested in what happens next.
I think the biggest challenge we face at the local level, and has been touched on already, is unlike at the federal level, there's a very high turnover of leadership at the local level. And there's institutional knowledge. I've been here 21 years, he's been here 28 years. You got a large cadre of people in the Washington, D.C. local arena that are, you know, in that 20 to 30 year range, and work their way in various stages of their career. But with local level leadership is typically on a 4-year cycle. And emergency management, police, fire, you know, those things. So that very high turnover around the region in leadership in the public safety arena creates a constant learning curve. Fortunately, there's always some very experienced senior people to continue to bring those new folks along as they come in. And at the executive level as well. You know, the political cycle turnover is pretty high. So you always worry about that constant turnover in terms of institutional knowledge. But I think the other weakness really is largely financial. I mean, there's been a lot of work done. I think the challenges going forward are going to be a lot more complex. I mean, we're talking about cyber. I mean, we've been hacked. You know, the Metropolitan Police Department, the FBI, we've been hacked by Anonymous and others. So the challenges going forward are not cheap solutions, and I think with the crisis we've been in financially, that's my biggest fear, is that we're going to be presented with challenges and not be able to afford the solutions.
So adding to that, I think it's, you know, it's keeping our organizations adaptable, you know, an ability, and you know, the chief and my experience both, you know, having come up through the ranks. Speaking for myself, and I would guess that she probably feels the same way, I didn't set out to be the fire chief. Right, I set out to, you know, ride fire trucks and crawl down smoky hallways and help sick people. I mean, I didn't see myself necessarily in this role, and I certainly didn't see what a fire and EMS organization is all about, doing the kinds of things that we do today. Mm-hmm. So it's about, how do I understand what's on the horizon, you know, both near and long term, and how do I, in the face of the financial pressures, how do I get my workforce and my organization to be able to adapt in ways that can, you know, can then react to differing threats effectively. The chief and I both, I think, agree that, you know, from the standpoint of, you know, is it a 9/11, is it an anthrax? We're all worried right now about, you know, the lone wolves and the, you know, the Mumbai kind of incident. And so we are building capabilities. You know, you heard about her active shooter teams. And on my end, we've created something called the Rescue Task Force, which puts our people in what might commonly be referred to as a warm zone to deal with casualties. Because we've recognized that this is not the old kind of barricade situation where, you know, a guy gets liquored up, pops off a couple of street lights, and then goes and hangs out in his apartment waiting for the SWAT team to roust him. In that model, my role, my organization's role is to stand by until there's an all clear given. But what we envision now, what we've seen in other areas of the world, and what we see, whether it's school shootings, which are all still too popular, as we were reminded just the other day, or the really dynamic events like Mumbai. It isn't just her organization that has to adapt to that. It's my organization that also has to adapt because we play a role in that. And then we got to figure out, because this is so dynamic, how we ensure that information sharing and unified command efforts are solid on the incident scene.
And then the more complex part of it is the cyber threat going forward. I have 5,000 employees. All of our employees are career service employees. Most of them do 20, 25 years. We hire them with a certain set of skills.
Right.
And as the threats change, you have to change your recruiting and your requirements and your training. And a 5,000 person organization doesn't move really swiftly. We're a little slow on making those big changes in government. And so that's a real vulnerability because the threat is constantly emerging, and we have to constantly get our workforces prepared for that. And it means right from the day and the way you recruit.
Any senior elected official or appointed official in any community or jurisdiction has to rely on the professionalism of the chiefs and the career officials that are in the departments they serve. And you talk about the turnover. And Jim's kind of a leading question because I know you went to the Naval Postgraduate School program, and they do a program called the METS program, which is a mobile educational program. I like to jokingly refer to it as scared straight for elected officials, where essentially on day one they ought to be sat in a room and said, this is all the things that can happen to you.
Yep.
And your life will be miserable. And here are the people you need to rely on. How do you how can we as a nation, not just in the national capital region, begin to institutionalize that understanding where ultimately as new officials take their roles, they're put through something that really indoctrinates them into the what-ifs and the challenges and the capabilities their communities have.
Well, you're exactly right about the METS program, and we did the METS program in Arlington last fall. We brought the folks from the Naval Postgraduate School in. We got our county board, the elected officials, and the school board. We got the school board in the same room. We put them all in the same room, along with all of the agency heads, not just public safety, but all of the agency heads, because we rely on all of those agencies in a crisis. Everybody, as my former boss, Ron Carly, likes to say, you may come to work, in Parks and Rec or Human Services, at 8 o'clock in the morning. But if the crisis is big enough, you're going to be a first responder like the guys in uniform because we're going to need you too. So we did the METS program, and it was amazingly effective. That is the start. You got to get those policymakers to accept and understand that this is a primary responsibility of community, okay? Not just government, but of community. And so their ability to be out and speak about these challenges is really important. And I think the chief would agree that one of our other challenges is we worry about the further and further we get away from the large events, the more people think we're all safe and it isn't going to happen again. And maybe it's human nature, but it certainly is the nature of a bureaucratic system to go focus on, other more pressing needs.
Issue of the day.
Issue of the day. And so it's a constant thing. I think our bringing in the METS team, which, by the way, we're bringing in for the entire region's senior leadership here very shortly, so that the leaders across jurisdictions can be in the same room and hear this same message. I think you can't go 10 years. You can't do it once and then say, got that done, move on to the next issue. It's got to, our role is to continue to keep this in front of the policymakers and make it important. I would just put in a plug, too, that, institutionally, I'd like to see us making preparedness and awareness for these kinds of issues part of our public education system, part of the public education curriculum. When you think about the effectiveness of stop, drop, and roll, and check your clock, change your battery, change your clock, change your battery, exit drills in the home. I mean, these are things that as adults we've all been shamed into because our children have come home and pressed us on them. But we really have changed human behavior, at least in the fire safety world.
Through the kids.
Through the kids, that's right. So the more we could get that down into the school system, we might grow a generation of more prepared people and keep this at an elevated level, because as the chief indicates, it's not going away. It's just not. What's out there as it evolves may look different next year than it looks today, but it's certainly not going away.
Another question from the audience? We have time for a few more. Over here.
My question is for Chief Lanier, Sam Huff, LEID Products. Ryan Braun is going to be playing left field for the Milwaukee Brewers on opening day because of a chain of custody issue. And with 32 agencies in your region, what kind of steps do you take to ensure chain of custody, and how do you work with other agencies, and is that an issue for you guys going forward? Because, you know, a guy's playing left field, big deal, but we don't want a bad person walking the streets because of evidence issues.
Sure, no, sure. And you know, we really haven't had those kinds of challenges here. And you know, again, I have to say a lot of it has been just because it is institutionalized here. We have all worked together so well for so many years, and people that don't have the right personalities in these jobs, they don't last very long. Personalities are huge in making sure that these things are done and done right. So we kind of weed those folks out pretty quickly when they don't you know, understand the importance of that. But the scenario I gave you was an exact example of that at the Holocaust Museum, and you know, that was my first, almost immediate concern as we were converging on the scene, is at the lowest levels, you know, the sergeants and the detectives, that my homicide guys arriving on the scene was going to get into a scuffle with the park police, who was trying to bring in buses to take the witnesses out. You know, we need to interview those witnesses. Yes, there's not a homicide yet, but you got an 80-year-old guy that's shot in the head. We didn't know at the time it would be the security guard that died. But so that's the important part of what I said before. It's not just having that chain of custody that you're talking about. It's got to be institutionalized from the top to the bottom. And then when there are problems, it has to be addressed immediately. And I think we're just fortunate here because we do it so much every day.
Question over here.
Good afternoon. Chris Barrett with Capstone Corporation. My question deals with evacuation planning and execution. I gauge traffic now on a scale relative to 9/11, when obviously, for obvious reasons, there was just a you know, gridlock for quite a time. But considering, again, jurisdictional divisions, communication coordination, but one of the unique capacities of DC is the fact that OPM controls a large majority of the population workforce. Can you address the feasibility or any progress being made towards zone-based evacuations? Yeah,
there's a working group that's working on things. There's been a lot of, you know, recent changes since I think the earthquake was the last big one. But I think there's one thing that has to be acknowledged, and people on the outside or that are find themselves in a situation that have to understand is there is only so much capacity in the infrastructure that exists. And there are going to be people, even when we have zone-based timed releases, that are not going to follow the rules. And when that infrastructure reaches capacity, then what do? And that's what happened on the earthquake. I mean, you know, with the earthquake, I was out, I was in a building, and, you know, I watched everybody that was inside of a building in Washington, D.C., especially in the downtown area, left that building when it started shaking. We're not from California, you know, and instinct when a building starts rocking like that is get out of the building. That's what I did. But because everybody was out, it was a nice day, everybody just started to leave the city. So the capacity was at max. Now, we coordinated very well with, you know, running, you know, for example, all of Georgia Avenue, all 4 lanes outbound, and prohibiting inbound on Georgia and only letting inbound on 13th Street. And we coordinated that with Montgomery County around through our traffic coordination. We have a traffic management desk and our DDOTs and VDOTs. But you still have to remember that even with the very best plan, there are going to be times when people don't follow instruction out of fear, especially if something big happens. And they're going to flood the infrastructure, and we have to have plans for that, because he's got to get fire trucks and ambulances in. Yeah. And I've got to get, you know, armed people around the city to deal with threats that go on. And that's, I think, going to be the bigger challenge. What's the plan, no matter how good our plan is, when it doesn't work and people panic and they flood our infrastructure? That's the plan we need to be working on.
Yeah, I'll just follow up real quick on that. You know, the earthquake was a great example. So too was the snowstorm, such as it was, January 23rd last year. You know, where we had the rain, instant created ice, you know, and then we got the snow on top of it. We had 75 metro buses that were sideways on roads.
Trees down everywhere.
Right. And what OPM took up in coordination with the rest of the region was that they have to put some policies in place to, you know, to say to their employees, you know, when we tell you to leave, you got to leave. And if you don't, you're staying. the shelter in place or the stay in place component of the evacuation scenario is a really big one. In fact, while we don't envision a lot of events that would necessitate an actual full-scale evacuation, we do know that there are certain events when we will not want anybody to go, or at least in certain areas, to go anywhere, right? Think about, the potential biological attack, the potential nuclear event. Those are kinds of things where we are going to want people to stay exactly where they are. And if that means, not rendezvousing with loved ones and doing family reunification as quickly as people might like, so be it. But OPM has taken some big steps in the direction of telling their workforce, when we tell you to go, you'll go. That's when you'll go. But if you don't, you're not leaving.
And that's new since, I think that's relatively new. We've seen twice now since the last incident where OPM has done exactly that. Right. And I think we're good on the weather-related incidents, because people that got stuck for 7 hours in their cars on that last snowstorm are not going to do that again. And there was a lot of them. But my worry is going to be when it's crisis, when there's a big event and people panic and they've got to get children and they're just trying to get to their family and get out, and there's possibly trees down and things that there's nothing that we can do about it. We got to have a plan for that.
Right.
You may have answered this, but the question is centered around the earthquake, and it's for both of you. What are some of the lessons learned from that event for your disaster recovery planning, things of that nature?
The lessons learned is we need to plan for that. It actually, that went much better than the snowstorm, the snow ice storm. I mean, literally, this city was cleared out, and that happened about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. By 5 o'clock, the city was clear. I mean, I was out on the streets the whole time, and major rush hour roadways, because we put a traffic plan to pull people out of the city pretty quickly. So that actually went fairly well compared to the snowstorm. I think implementing that immediate, getting that traffic plan and that traffic management thing going helped quite a bit for us for that. Had that been a little bit worse and we had debris in the roadways where you couldn't actually evacuate, that would have been a much bigger challenge. And that's the thing that I think we really need to start thinking in the next stages, is when you can't move people and they're trying to move, then what do you do?
Yeah, I had the good fortune of being, it was good fortune. I was on an airplane on the tarmac at National Airport when the earthquake happened. I immediately texted our emergency manager, did we just have an earthquake? We were delayed about 20 minutes, and then we took off, and it was somebody else's problem.
Thanks.
This is one of those, this is the dimension of a crisis that we tend to pay a little bit less attention to, because you think about it, the earthquake was over in just a couple of seconds, and then really, because we didn't have a lot of difficulties, we were sort of into the recovery mode all of a sudden, right? And so assessing buildings as to whether or not everybody was gone by 5 o'clock, but are they safe to come back in the next day, became a real challenge. Yep. Now, most of that's on private building owners to assess, but most of us lease space in those buildings, and we have to have some solutions to that. One of the things, to just sort of expand that scenario a little bit further, that we've done in Arlington is we've actually done some work around recovery from those catastrophic incidents. We focused on explosive events. If we had the big explosion and you had buildings down, the aspect of debris removal, forget about people getting out. Again, it's back to the responders getting in. You got debris removal, which is a huge challenge. Where are the resources going to come to do that? Where's the restoration of power and access to roadways, those sorts of things. So we are doing some work on those things that I think will have applicability in the earthquake scenarios and
for the next one.
Yeah, exactly.
We have time for probably one more question, and then I'd like to give both of our panelists an opportunity to have a last word. Right here.
Good afternoon. I'm Fiona Barshow with Citizen. Can you speak to how the advancement in information sharing capabilities is supporting intelligence-led policing in your jurisdictions?
Well, there's a lot of things that have been useful to us, both in the social media world. There are ways now to use Twitter, to use some of the social media on a daily basis through open source analytical type software, to use it to our advantage to get an operating environment of what threats we may be facing. I'll give you an example, the school shooting in Ohio, or any incident-based where you can now, that you may be able to gain some information through the social media. There's ways for us to extract that now and use that to our advantage, using strictly over the, off-the-shelf, open source type products. But there's also some of the law enforcement specific stuff that has helped us tremendously that, obviously I can't elaborate on a whole lot in a non-law enforcement sensitive environment, but I would say the advancement of technology in terms of our ability to predict, prevent, and detect is significant in the past 5 years.
With that, I'd like to offer you a chance to have a few closing comments and and if you could weave into it just one last thing, and that is, what are you most proud of moving forward that you've been able to accomplish that you want to see sustained?
Well, first let me say, thanks for this opportunity. I think the Chief and I both agree that, the more these conversations are taking place, the more we socialize some of these issues, we come to some common understanding, whether it's, in your various industries or what we are doing. So thanks for the opportunity to have this discussion today, and thanks for the questions, because I always take away from the questions too, some other things that maybe I need to go be paying more attention to. I think there isn't a done point for this. I think what, arguably 9/11 presented to us is a different world and a different understanding of the challenges that we face in this country that perhaps, we thought beforehand the oceans separated us from. And to me, I think our continued success will be driven by our ability to get communities to coalesce, to get neighborhoods to understand the importance of the involvement of the average citizen, what kind of role they play in the Homeland Security enterprise, because the enterprise isn't just the uniforms, right? It's not just emergency managers and public health officials. It's us as an American society. And the more we can acknowledge that the human beings, the people that live in our neighborhoods are a part of that, and the more we can engage them as a part of it, I think that's a key to a resilient society, and it's a key to us as public servants understanding better how to meet our mission of serving the public.
I would say the thing that I'm probably most proud of is the thing that I thought would be the most difficult to accomplish, and that is over the past 10 years, really shifting the culture of law enforcement. I mean, uniformed services are notoriously very traditional and very culture-driven, and to move to intelligence-led policing the policing errors change about every 50 years, from the different models of policing. I'm sure the same in the fire service. And when I set out to change the culture to one of empowerment and prevention and a mindset that not only can we, but we must be able to prevent things from happening, and the reliance on technology to help us better the way we do our jobs. I knew it was going to be a huge fight to change that culture. It turned out not to be as big a fight as I thought, and I'm when I look at the way we do things today compared to the way we did things 10 years ago, when we started this evolution, I wouldn't have thought we'd been this far along as we are right now. For anybody that's been at this conference for the past few years, will remember my first year here when I talked about what it was like in the Metropolitan Police Department. Everything we did was paper and pencil. We had no analytic capability whatsoever. We had no technology. Right now I have one of the most advanced technological police departments in the country. So not only have we changed the culture, we've embraced it, and now are cutting edge and leading other law enforcement. So it's just to me, that's the thing that's meant the most.
Thank you both for being with us. Certainly appreciate the service that you provide to the National Capital Region and your jurisdictions, but more importantly, the advice and wisdom that you can give the rest of the country through this process. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Wow, that was a lot better than I even anticipated that it could be. So thank you. Thank you, all three of you. Thanks for eliciting from them some really additional thoughts, I think. And certainly Chief Schwartz, Chief Lanier, thanks for being here. And one more great thanks for Citizen, the sponsor of today's lunch. I think they're already ready to sponsor next year because we're going to bring you back. So I was trying to accomplish a lot there with that one statement.